The North American corn industry has been deeply intertwined with the growth of agriculture in both the United States and Mexico for over 3 decades. Mexico has long been the largest export market for U.S. corn, accounting for more than 43% of total U.S. corn exports. However, in 2025, when Mexico banned the cultivation of genetically modified GM corn, the shift created major challenges for the U.S. corn export sector, while opening the door for Canada to emerge as a serious competitor. Mexico, one of the largest corn-consuming markets in the world, made a historic decision when it banned the domestic cultivation of genetically modified corn. This move wasn't just about protecting Mexico's native corn varieties. It signaled a broader shift in how the country views agricultural production and food policy. The ban has had a direct impact not only on domestic corn farming, but also on imports of GM corn from the United States. In Mexico, corn isn't just a staple food. It carries deep cultural significance. The use of GM corn, which many fear could harm biodiversity and undermine traditional farming practices, sparked widespread backlash. Aware of these risks, the Mexican government took action to safeguard native corn species and the broader agricultural ecosystem. According to the USDA's Foreign Agricultural Service, roughly 50% of Mexico's GM corn imports come from the U.S. This heavy reliance has put Mexico in a tough position following the ban, forcing a major shift in sourcing. For U.S. agriculture, the impact has been especially painful, with GM corn exports to Mexico falling and prices already under pressure. The industry is facing a difficult adjustment. The U.S. has long held its position as the largest corn supplier to Mexico, but recent policy changes in Mexico, combined with growing domestic challenges, have made it increasingly difficult to maintain that trade flow. One of the key factors affecting exports is the introduction of tariffs, along with ongoing instability in Mexico's quality inspection procedures, both of which have added layers of uncertainty and cost for U.S. corn exporters. One of the biggest challenges the U.S. now faces is the imposition of new tariffs on imports from Mexico and Canada, a move that has directly driven up transportation costs. According to Reuters, starting in 2025, the U.S. government implemented new tariff rates on goods coming from these key trading partners, including corn, causing a significant spike in export costs. Specifically, since the new tariffs went into effect, transportation costs for U.S. corn exporters have risen by nearly 25%. This has made American corn less competitive compared to corn from countries like Canada and Brazil, which are not subject to the same trade barriers. Shipping costs from key southern U.S. ports, especially New Orleans and Houston, have surged to around $5,000 per container, nearly double the cost in 2024. These rising costs are eroding the global competitiveness of U.S. corn, particularly at a time when Mexico is actively seeking lower-cost alternatives to meet its domestic demand. Beyond tariffs, another major hurdle for U.S. corn exports is the tightening of quality inspection procedures at American ports. Stricter regulations on chemical residue and grain quality have led to significant delays and congestion, especially at southern ports. Between March and April 2025, more than 180 corn ships were reportedly stuck waiting at major ports like New Orleans, Houston, and Galveston due to backlogs in quality inspections. According to DTN Progressive Farmer, the combination of rigorous testing and port congestion has resulted in many shipments facing rejection or falling short of export standards. In some cases, substandard corn shipments have been returned or destroyed entirely, leading to substantial financial losses for exporters. As the U.S. struggles to maintain its share of corn exports to Mexico, Canada has moved swiftly to seize the opportunity and strengthen its position in the global corn trade. Provinces like Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Ontario, known for their sustainable agricultural practices, have emerged as powerful contenders to the U.S., especially as American producers fall short of meeting Mexico's strict demand for non-GMO corn. One of Canada's key strengths in the global corn export industry lies in its transparent and sustainable production strategy. The country has made major investments in traceability systems, most notably through the use of blockchain technology to monitor every stage of corn production and transportation. This technology ensures that each step in the corn supply chain is accurately tracked and verified. Transparency and sustainability are becoming top priorities for international markets. Corn importing countries increasingly demand products with clear origins, compliance with environmental protection standards, and farming practices that do not harm ecosystems. By adopting blockchain, Canada not only boosts product quality but also meets these rising expectations, making Canadian corn increasingly attractive to global buyers. Although Canadian corn is priced slightly higher than its U.S. counterpart, around $4.7 per bushel compared to $4.5 for U.S. corns, buyers are increasingly willing to pay the small premium in exchange for supply chain stability and strict quality standards. This has become a competitive advantage for Canada, especially when exporting to more demanding markets like Mexico. According to the USDA's Foreign Agricultural Service, Canada's corn exports to Mexico grew by 20% in 2025, signaling a clear shift among Mexican importers away from U.S. corn toward Canadian sources. With Mexico now actively seeking suppliers of non-GMO corn, Canada's reputation for consistent, high-quality production is opening up a significant opportunity. Canada, through its transparent and sustainable agricultural strategies, has carved out a significant competitive edge in the global corn market. In 2025, Canadian corn exports to Mexico grew by 20%, a clear sign of shifting demand among corn-importing countries. More and more nations are seeking non-GMO products, and Canada, with its commitment to environmental standards and product quality, has proven capable of meeting that demand. While the U.S. remains a major corn exporter, Canada is emerging as a formidable contender. Canadian non-GMO corn is now being embraced by countries across Europe as well as by South Korea and Japan, opening new markets for Canadian producers and reducing the country's reliance on Mexico, where U.S. corn is no longer dominating the way it once did. Another major factor affecting farmers is the high cost of production, especially in key corn-producing states like Iowa, Nebraska, and Illinois. According to DTN Progressive Farmer, production costs in Iowa and surrounding regions remain elevated, averaging around $165 per acre. At the same time, corn prices have dropped sharply, now hovering around just $4.50 per bushel. This mismatch between high input costs and low market prices has severely squeezed farmers' profit margins, creating an unprecedented level of financial strain across the industry. Many growers are now facing a tough reality: rising costs to stay in the game while earning less than ever for their crops. With production costs holding steady while corn prices have dropped sharply, many farmers are finding themselves unable to break even, leading to losses and mounting debt. To keep their operations afloat, some have been forced to sell off land or take on side jobs just to cover debts from the previous harvest. This isn't just a personal financial strain. It's a threat to the broader stability of American agriculture. Amid mounting debts and shrinking profits, many American farmers are being forced to sell their land or take on extra jobs just to stay afloat. According to DTN Progressive Farmer, land sales have become a growing trend among farmers in key corn-producing states like Iowa and Nebraska, a troubling sign that U.S. agriculture is facing a serious crisis, one that could undermine future corn production. When farmers are compelled to sell land or scale back operations to stay financially afloat, it's not just individual livelihoods that are at risk. This trend threatens the entire agricultural infrastructure. From jobs in food processing and transportation to services tied to rural economies. If the situation continues, the U.S. agricultural sector could see a significant drop in output and lose its competitive edge against other major global producers. On July 14, 2025, a statement from the U.S. Department of Commerce sent shockwaves through the entire North American agricultural market. The Trump administration unexpectedly terminated the 2019 tomato suspension agreement and slapped a 17.09% tariff on all fresh tomato imports from Mexico. What left businesses and consumers in utter shock wasn't just the tariff itself, but the way it was implemented. No transition period, no prior warning. Truckloads of tomatoes already en route across the border were immediately taxed. It was a move that bore Trump's unmistakable signature: decisive, unilateral, and driven by the slogan, "Protect American farmers," above any traditional trade agreement. But the price Americans had to pay, many didn't see it coming. Behind the rhetoric of defending agriculture lay a clear political calculation. The Trump administration aimed to bolster its protectionist image and score points with key farm states ahead of the election. At the same time, the move sent a strong warning that the U.S. was ready to punish any trade partner it deemed unfair. But this politically charged policy immediately collided with the reality of supply chains and with the grocery carts of everyday Americans. Each year, the U.S. imports nearly $3 billion worth of tomatoes from Mexico, around 1.8 million tons, making up 70% to 90% of all fresh tomatoes consumed nationwide. Once the tariffs kicked in, retail prices surged 10% to 11% within just the first few weeks, and could climb to 18% to 20% during the off-season. The result? Border consumers and businesses were the first to suffer, while domestic farmers couldn't immediately reap the benefits. Drought, labor shortages, and short growing seasons meant U.S. production couldn't ramp up overnight. A single politically driven decision turned one of the most common produce items into the epicenter of a price crisis, setting off a domino effect with long-term consequences for the U.S. economy and trade. For years, farmers in Florida and California, the two states that account for around 90% of U.S. fresh tomato production, have faced intense competition from Mexico. Mexican tomatoes are 15% to 20% cheaper, thanks to labor costs of just $2 to $3 per hour in a year-round growing season that allows for a steady, uninterrupted supply to the North American market. In contrast, U.S. farmers deal with $14 to $16 per hour labor costs, frequent droughts, and strict environmental regulations, making domestic production significantly more expensive. Trade groups like the Florida Tomato Exchange have repeatedly warned that without protective measures, American farmers would lose their competitive edge in their own backyard. In that context, Trump's tariffs emerged as a swift and decisive response, not only aimed at easing domestic pressure, but also at reinforcing a political message that he would protect American farmers at all costs. Within just the first few weeks, nationwide tomato prices rose an average of 10% to 11%, and experts warned they could climb as high as 20% during the off-season when domestic supply typically drops. The price spikes were particularly stark across different tomato varieties. Beefsteak tomatoes jumped from $2.99 per kilogram to $3.30, $3.50 per kilogram. Roma tomatoes rose from under $1 per kilogram to $1.50, $2 per kilogram. Organic and specialty tomatoes saw the sharpest increases, 30% to 40%, quickly turning into a luxury item for many families. For importing businesses, the shock was even more severe. Nature Sweet, a major supplier to the H-E-B grocery chain, reported losses of over $1 million per week, due to both the tariff burden and delivery disruptions. The surge in prices wasn't driven by tariffs alone. It was also fueled by defensive pricing behavior from distributors who feared supply chain breakdowns and growing instability in import flows. The surge in tomato prices didn't just show up on receipts, it quietly worked its way into everyday meals and livelihoods across America. In Midwestern schools, the familiar lunchroom salad began to disappear. To cut costs, schools were forced to replace fresh tomatoes with cabbage, mashed potatoes, or frozen vegetables. As a result, school meals lost their bright colors and became noticeably lower in nutrition, a change even young children could easily notice. In restaurants and fast food chains, the shift was subtle but unmistakable. Fresh salsa and pico de gallo, key ingredients that defined flavor, were swapped out for canned sauces or prepackaged alternatives. Observant diners immediately sensed the drop in freshness and quality, even as prices continued to climb 10% to 11% in the first few weeks and potentially up to 18% to 20% during the off-season. In households across the country, especially among low-income families, the price shock hit the hardest. Fresh tomatoes were cut from grocery lists, replaced by canned beans, pasta, and cheaper, less nutritious foods. This wasn't just a change in taste. It was a direct hit to family nutrition and health, especially for growing children. The impact spilled over into border towns where local economies depend heavily on agricultural imports from Mexico. Cold storage facilities, loading docks, truck drivers, and distribution workers in Texas and Florida faced reduced hours or layoffs as import volumes plunged. Estimates suggest that as many as 46,000 jobs and $8.3 billion in revenue across border communities are at risk if the tariff remains in place. In other words, Trump's tariffs didn't just target Mexico, they struck directly at the wallets of American consumers, altered eating habits, hurt nutrition, and pushed tens of thousands of border workers into economic uncertainty. In response to the 17.09% U.S. tariff, Mexico took an unusual strategy. There were no heated press conferences, no threats of retaliation, and no attempt to turn the situation into a media war. Instead of engaging in a head-on confrontation, Mexico chose silence and a strategic pivot, quietly working to preserve revenue and stabilize its export markets. The path Mexico chose was clear: redirect trade flows to Canada, where it saw a safer, more sustainable market. As soon as Trump's 17.09% tariff took effect, Canada's largest retail chains, Loblaws, Metro, and Sobeys, moved quickly to sign long-term import contracts with Mexican exporters, extending through 2030. These agreements secured a stable tomato supply for Canada, a country that consumes around 800,000 tons of tomatoes annually, with 60% to 70% of that total dependent on imports. Previously, much of that supply passed through the U.S. as a central transit hub, but Trump's tariffs forced a shift in the trade route. Data shows that in 2024, Canada imported $310 million worth of Mexican tomatoes. After the U.S. imposed tariffs, that trade flow surged, and experts now predict it could reach $2.8 billion by 2026, almost matching the size of the U.S. market that Mexico just lost. Remarkably, these contracts span 5 to 7 years, a rarity in the fresh produce industry, signaling that Mexico places far greater trust in Canada than in the U.S. As a result, Canadian retail chains have become more than just buyers. They've become strategic partners, helping Mexico stabilize revenue and dramatically reduce its dependence on the U.S. market. Alongside locking in supply through long-term contracts, Canada has made major investments in logistics infrastructure to transform itself into a strategic gateway for Mexican agricultural products in North America. New cold storage facilities and distribution centers in Ontario, Quebec, and British Columbia can now handle and preserve over 50,000 tons of fresh produce, cutting long-haul spoilage rates by 15% to 20%. Bilingual English-French packaging lines allow products to be ready for direct export to Europe, opening up new markets beyond domestic consumption. If Mexico's shift toward exporting to Canada continues, the U.S. could face a double loss, not just in the tomato industry, but also in its strategic role in North American trade. In the past, the U.S. served as the central transit hub for agricultural goods in the region. Produce from Mexico typically passed through the U.S. before being redistributed to Canada or exported to other markets. Cold storage facilities, inland ports, logistics firms, and distribution centers across the U.S. benefited enormously from this role, generating tens of thousands of jobs and billions of dollars annually in ancillary revenue. But now Canada is steadily taking over that position. Distribution hubs in Ontario, Quebec, and British Columbia are replacing the U.S. as the main transit points for Mexican produce. Today we're talking about a major slip in consumer trust, a slip that's coming from places you least expect, brands you've always believed to be affordable and reliable, from Walmart to Nike, from Tide detergent to Adidas shoes. Prices are rising faster than incomes, and the 2025 tariffs are the spark that's driving these costs through the roof. Since April 2025, the Trump administration has officially implemented a new series of tariffs on imported goods, with average rates ranging from 27% to 50%, and some categories facing sky-high tariffs of up to 145%. The stated goal is to protect domestic manufacturing from foreign competition. But what's really happening? The ones paying the price are not the big corporations or multinational giants. It's ordinary consumers like you and me. According to a report from the Yale Budget Lab, these tariff policies are costing American households between $2,100 and $3,800 each year just to repurchase the same items they once bought at a lower price. And what's even harsher, those goods are not only more expensive, but often of poorer quality, as companies are forced to cut costs or change suppliers to adapt to the new tariffs. Walmart, the largest retailer in the United States, and once a symbol of the everyday low prices motto, has now failed to maintain that commitment. In fact, they were one of the first companies to sound the alarm: price hikes are unavoidable. According to an AP report from June 2025, a range of essential items like car seats, vacuum cleaners, and imported fruits are now facing record import tariffs of up to 145%, though these were later temporarily adjusted to an average of 30 to 50%. Walmart's CFO bluntly admitted, "We can't continue absorbing these costs forever." As a result, consumers, especially the working class, are now paying an additional 20% to 30% each week just to repurchase the same items they bought last year. Target, the retail brand known for its slogan, "Expect more, pay less," is now forced to change its motto to "Expect the unexpected," especially when it comes to prices. Since June 2025, Target's CEO has bluntly stated, "Price increases will happen, if necessary." Although the company has worked to reduce the percentage of imports from China to under 25%, it still cannot avoid the ripple effects of the new tariff policies. Specifically, items in the back-to-school season, like school supplies, have increased by 15%. Household appliances such as pots, blenders, and cleaning devices have risen by 10 to 18%, and children's clothing has seen an average price hike of 12%. As a result, a family of 4 could be spending an additional $350 to $500 this back-to-school season, just to repurchase the same items they bought last year at much lower prices. What were once considered basic expenses are now becoming an unavoidable financial burden. Take a walk through the supermarket and stop by the detergent, shampoo, and cleaning product aisles. You'll notice that prices are quietly but steadily slipping out of reach. Procter & Gamble, P&G, the company behind familiar brands like Tide, Ariel, Head & Shoulders, Gillette, and Pampers, has officially announced that 25% of its products in the United States will see price hikes starting in August 2025. The reason? To cover the massive tariff cost of up to $1 billion they'll be shouldering in fiscal year 2026. The specific numbers are even more shocking for consumers. A 150-ounce bottle of Tide is going up from $15.99 to $18.89. A pack of Pampers diapers will rise by about $2. And a set of Gillette razors will cost 10 to 15% more than just a few months ago. You might be able to skip buying a new pair of shoes, but you can't skip doing laundry. You can't skip changing diapers. And it's hard to go without basic hygiene products. These tariffs aren't targeting luxury items. They're directly hitting the basic right to cleanliness and care for middle-income families. Adidas, the global sportswear brand, has issued a clear warning to investors. The new tariff costs will lead to a loss of over $231 million in just the second half of 2025. To cope with this financial shock, the company is forced to raise retail prices on many of its key products. For example, the Adidas Ultra Boost shoes, which once sold for $180, are now priced between $200 and $210, depending on the version and region. What's more, sportswear produced in Vietnam and Indonesia, 2 of Adidas's major suppliers, will now face additional tariffs ranging from 19% to 27%, starting in August 2025. In a public statement, Adidas's CEO was blunt. "We cannot compromise on quality, but customers will definitely feel the price increase." And indeed, customers are already feeling every penny being drained from their wallets. Nike, a global icon in the sportswear industry, officially raised prices on a range of products starting June 1, 2025, leaving consumers stunned. A familiar pair of Air Max sneakers has now gone up from $129 to $145, while Nike hoodies saw an average price increase of about 15%. Even seemingly safe items like children's clothing haven't escaped this price surge, with increases ranging from 10% to 18%. While Nike remains steadfast in its claim of protecting the user experience, more and more customers are starting to question, is this price hike really due to tariffs, or is the company using this as an opportunity to quietly boost its profits? Shine, the popular fast fashion platform that once ruled among young people and students, has officially announced a price increase starting April 25, 2025. The reason given is the sharp rise in global logistics costs, which have increased by 18 to 25%, along with the removal of tax incentives for Chinese goods, causing a sudden spike in import costs. As a result, even the super cheap items that Shine was known for can no longer maintain their attractive prices. A Shine dress that once cost $9.99 is now priced between $12.99 and $14.99. Fast shipping fees, which were once just $3.99, have now climbed to $6.99, almost the cost of a small item. For millions of young users, students, and low-income workers, Shein was once the go-to solution for affordable fashion. But now, cheap is just a distant memory. As the saying goes, when politicians levy taxes, it's the people who pay the price. And this has never been more true than right now. In the midst of the 2025 tariff storm, global retailers, from Walmart, Target, to Nike and Shein, are shifting the entire cost burden onto consumers, bit by bit, item by item. What's worth questioning is, are the tariffs truly protecting domestic production as originally intended? Or are they simply a political ploy to legitimize price hikes, forcing the public to accept these new prices as a fait accompli? I believe that while major corporations continue to announce profits and maintain dividends for shareholders, the American people, those living on fixed salaries, social assistance, or average incomes, are tightening their belts every single day. This is incredibly tough for them. You're not just buying laundry detergent, shoes, or a facial cleanser. You're paying into a system that lacks transparency, where tariffs have become a shield to justify every price increase. According to a survey by Talker Research, 70% of Americans believe the economy won't recover for at least the next 19 months. And here's another concerning statistic. 44% of people have cut back on their travel and major summer expenses in 2025. Not because they don't want to enjoy life, but simply because they no longer have the financial means to do so. No.